I moved into my new house last year, and at first, everything seemed perfect. The neighborhood was peaceful, the backyard was spacious, and the street was quiet. But little did I know, this seemingly idyllic life was about to be disrupted, thanks to one particular neighbor who would soon turn into the source of all my troubles. I never thought I'd have to deal with an entitled neighbor, but that's exactly what happened. It all began when I noticed cars cutting through my property. At first, it wasn't a big deal, just a few cars here and there using the narrow strip of land behind my house as a shortcut to the HOA neighborhood nearby. Since I had just moved in, I assumed it might be something normal for the area that I just didn't know about yet. But over time, it became more frequent. Cars were driving across my property every day, and it was starting to bother me. The noise became disruptive, especially when some drivers began speeding through the strip, tearing up the grass, and leaving deep ruts in the ground. One day, I came home from work to find that a car had veered off the path entirely and badly damaged my yard. That was the final straw. I couldn't just ignore it anymore, especially since no one seemed to be taking responsibility. It was clear I had to act. I decided to contact the HOA, assuming they'd help resolve the issue. I explained that people were using my private property as a public road and causing damage in the process. To my surprise, they were completely uninterested. They told me the land wasn't technically under their jurisdiction and there was nothing they could do about it. I was frustrated and felt abandoned, but I wasn't about to let people continue treating my property like their personal shortcut. That's when I made up my mind, I'd build a fence. Not just any fence, but a strong, sturdy one with a locked gate to ensure no one could enter without my permission. I didn't want to cause conflict, but I had to protect my property. I hired a contractor, and within a few days, the fence was installed. Finally, I thought, the problem was solved. No one would be driving through my land anymore. But the trouble was only just beginning. A few days after the fence went up, I noticed a car parked right outside my gate. The driver was honking incessantly, and when I looked closer, I realized who it was, Karen, one of the HOA board members. She looked furious, and it was clear she wasn't happy about the new fence. As I walked up to her car, she stepped out, fuming, and started demanding that I open the gate immediately because she was already late for something. I tried to stay calm as she launched into an angry tirade. Karen told me, in no uncertain terms, that she didn't care about my property rights. She claimed she had been using that shortcut for years and insisted that I had no right to block it off. Her tone was condescending, as though her position on the HOA board gave her some kind of authority over me. But I wasn't about to let her intimidate me. I explained to her, firmly but politely, that the land was my private property, and I had every right to prevent anyone from driving through it. I pointed out that she, and anyone else who used the shortcut, was trespassing. That didn't sit well with her at all. Her face turned bright red, and she yelled that I couldn't block what she called a public road. She then threatened to report me to the HOA, as if that would somehow force me to remove the fence. Despite her threats and angry outburst, I stood my ground. I wasn't going to let her bully me into submission. Then, things escalated further. Karen pulled out her phone and started making a call. At first, I wasn't sure what she was doing, but soon enough, I realized she was calling the police. A few minutes later, I saw the flashing lights of a police car in the distance. The officers were on their way, and while part of me felt a sense of relief, this wasn't a situation that needed more shouting, but rather a calm, legal resolution. I also knew Karen wasn't going to back down without putting up a fight. As the car pulled up, I braced myself for what was about to unfold. Two officers stepped out of the vehicle, looking a little confused as they approached the scene. They walked over to Karen first, who stood by her car with an expression of pure fury. One of the officers asked her to explain the situation, and Karen launched into a rant, insisting that I had illegally blocked a public road that she and others had been using for years. She went on and on, spinning the story to make it sound like I was the one breaking the law. Once Karen finished her tirade, the officers turned to me for my side of the story. I took a deep breath and calmly explained everything. "Officers, this is my property," I said, pointing to the map I had brought for clarity. "I recently put up this gate because people, including Karen, have been using my land as a shortcut without permission. This isn't a public road, it's private property, and I have every right to restrict access." I showed the officers my official documents to back up my claim, and they nodded as they reviewed them. It was clear they understood the situation, but Karen wasn't ready to back down. She interrupted, yelling about how the HOA had always used the access point and insisting that I couldn't block it. Her voice grew louder, and her arguments became increasingly irrational. One of the officers turned to her and calmly but firmly explained, "Ma'am, this is not a public road. It's private property, and the landowner has the legal right to control access. The gate stays up." Karen's face turned bright red with anger as she argued back, claiming that I should be punished for blocking the so-called road. She refused to accept the officer's explanation and continued to rant about how I had ruined everything. Meanwhile, I stayed silent, trying to keep my composure as the officers dealt with her outburst. Finally, one of the officers seemed to lose patience. "We're done here," he said firmly. "You're trespassing, and the property owner has every right to put up a fence. You need to leave." Karen was livid, but there wasn't much she could do. The officers had made their decision, and she had no choice but to comply. She stormed off, muttering angrily under her breath as she got into her car. Before driving away, she turned to me with a glare. "This isn't over," she said through gritted teeth. "I'll make sure the HOA takes action against you. You'll regret this." I didn't respond. I'd made my stance clear, and I wasn't about to engage in another shouting match. As Karen drove off, I let out a sigh of relief, grateful that the officers had sided with me. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the last I'd hear from her. Later that night, I checked the footage from my security cameras. The video showed everything: Karen's meltdown, her exaggerated gestures, and even her phone call to the police. Watching it back, I couldn't help but chuckle at how absurd the situation had been. Karen acted as if she owned the land, completely ignoring the fact that she was the one in the wrong. For a while, things seemed to quiet down. No more cars drove through my property, and Karen's threats lost their sting. I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had learned her lesson. But as I would soon discover, this was only the beginning of what was shaping up to be a long and exhausting battle. A week after the police incident, I thought the chaos might finally be over. But peace was short-lived. Just when I began to think Karen had moved on, I received an official-looking letter in the mail. It was from the HOA, requesting a meeting to discuss the gate I had installed and the access I had blocked. I couldn't believe it. After everything, the police siding with me and the clear evidence that this was my private property, the HOA was still intent on pursuing the matter. It was clear Karen wasn't giving up, and now she had managed to drag the HOA into her crusade. At first, I was frustrated. The entire situation felt ridiculous. But I reminded myself that I had done everything legally and had the paperwork to prove it. I wasn't in the wrong, and no matter how much they tried, the HOA couldn't overstep its jurisdiction. I knew the land was mine and that decades of informal usage didn't turn private property into a public road. Still, I had a sinking feeling that this meeting wasn't going to be a simple conversation. The letter suggested a meeting at the HOA office, and I decided to attend. If they wanted to challenge me, I would be ready. I gathered everything I might need: property maps, photos of the fence and access point, security footage of Karen's behavior, and all the legal documentation proving my ownership and rights. I wasn't about to walk in unprepared. When the day arrived, I walked into the meeting room and immediately felt the tension. The HOA board members sat around a long table, eyeing me as though I were the villain in some neighborhood melodrama. At the head of the table sat Karen, arms crossed and a smug expression plastered on her face. She clearly believed she was going to emerge victorious. The board president began by outlining the issue, stating that my gate was blocking what they considered to be a public access point. Before he could say much, Karen cut in, adding her own spin to the story. "This shortcut is essential for our community," she said in a tone that tried to sound reasonable. "Blocking it forces us to use the main road, which adds significant time to our commutes. It's unfair to everyone." I waited until she finished, keeping my composure. When it was my turn, I stood up and calmly presented my case. "I understand your concerns," I began, "but this land is private property. I've done my research, and the HOA has no jurisdiction over land outside the community. This isn't a public road. It's my property, and I have the right to block access." Karen didn't take that well. She immediately shot back with more arguments, claiming that ownership didn't matter because the road had been used as a shortcut for years. "You're making things harder for everyone," she said, her voice rising. "This isn't just about you, it's about the whole community." But as the discussion continued, I noticed a shift in the room. Some of the board members started asking questions that hinted they weren't entirely convinced by Karen's stance. "Are we sure this falls under our jurisdiction?" one member asked. "If it's his property, do we even have the authority to enforce anything?" Another member chimed in, "I don't think we can legally force him to remove the gate if it's on private land." The room grew uncomfortably quiet, and I could see Karen's confidence start to waver. Her arguments were losing ground, and the board members were beginning to see the reality of the situation. I remained calm, reiterating that the HOA had no legal claim to my property and emphasizing that I had followed every legal channel to protect it. But Karen wasn't ready to accept defeat. She slammed her hands on the table and stood up, her face red with anger. "This isn't over," she exclaimed. "I'll take this to higher authorities if I have to. You'll regret letting him get away with this." The board president raised his hand, clearly trying to defuse the situation. "Karen," he said firmly, "I think we've discussed this enough. We'll need to consult our attorney and review the legalities before making any further decisions. For now, it seems we have no choice but to respect the property owner's rights." It was a small victory, but it felt significant. The board had finally acknowledged the limits of their authority, and while they weren't fully conceding, they were stepping back. Karen, on the other hand, looked like she was barely holding herself together. She stormed out of the room, muttering threats under her breath as she left. As I walked out of the meeting, I felt a sense of relief. While I knew Karen wasn't likely to let go entirely, I also knew I had done everything right. The law was on my side, and no amount of entitlement or bullying was going to change that. The days following the meeting were a strange mix of calm and underlying tension. While the HOA had decided to review the legalities of the situation, it was clear from their hesitant behavior that they weren't eager to escalate the matter further. They seemed to realize they didn't have a strong case to stand on and were beginning to back off. But Karen? She wasn't ready to let things go so easily. For the next few weeks, letters from the HOA started arriving at my door, each one more aggressive than the last. They demanded that I remove the gate and restore public access, threatening further legal action if I didn't comply. But it was clear to me that they were bluffing. I had already consulted with my lawyer, who assured me that everything I had done was completely legal. At first, each new letter brought a wave of annoyance, but I refused to let it get to me. I knew I was in the right. To stay vigilant, I checked my security cameras regularly to ensure no one was trying to bypass the gate. I also spoke with some of my neighbors who had been using the shortcut. A few apologized sincerely and promised to stop using the path. Others, however, seemed to act as if nothing had changed, holding on to a misplaced sense of entitlement to my property. But I wasn't about to let that slide. Then, one afternoon while I was out running errands, I got a call from my lawyer. Apparently, Karen had taken things a step further. She had hired her own attorney and was planning to take me to court. She claimed the HOA had authorized the road as a public access point and that I had violated a supposed community easement by blocking it. My lawyer reassured me, however, that no such easement existed and that Karen's case was baseless. While the news was a relief, it also brought a fresh wave of frustration. I wasn't interested in wasting time or money on a drawn-out court battle. At the same time, I wasn't about to back down. I decided it was time to take a bold step that I hoped would put an end to the situation for good. I contacted a local news station that often covered stories about property rights and HOA conflicts. If Karen and the HOA were determined to create a spectacle, I figured I might as well make sure the public knew the truth. I sent the station a brief summary of the situation, along with photos of my property, the fence, and the threatening letters I'd received from the HOA. To my surprise, the station responded quickly, expressing interest in doing an interview. A few days later, I found myself sitting in front of a camera, sharing my story. I explained how the HOA was overstepping its boundaries and how I had followed all the proper legal channels to protect my property. I also highlighted the lack of support from the HOA when the shortcut issue first began, and how their priorities seemed more aligned with their own interests than with the well-being of the community. The interview aired that evening, and the reaction was immediate. Supportive messages began pouring in from people in the area who shared their own horror stories about overbearing HOA boards. It seemed the news coverage had turned the tide in my favor. Karen, on the other hand, didn't seem to handle the public attention well. The following week, she called me directly. This time, her tone was different, softer, almost apologetic. "I saw the news," she began, her voice lacking the force and anger I'd come to expect. "I realize now that I may have overreacted. Some of our neighbors have spoken out against me and the HOA's actions. I see now that I've been too aggressive in trying to force you to change your property. I'm sorry for the way I acted." I was stunned. This wasn't the Karen I had been dealing with all these weeks. Her entitled, combative demeanor was gone, replaced by what seemed like genuine regret. While I wasn't about to forgive her completely, it was clear that the situation, and the backlash from the community, had forced her to confront her behavior. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe a little easier. The battle over my property wasn't just about a gate, it had become a lesson in standing up for my rights. And while I didn't know what the future held for Karen or the HOA, I knew one thing for sure: I had no regrets about standing my ground. After Karen's surprising apology, I thought the ordeal might finally be over. But since this was an HOA story, I knew better than to assume the drama had completely ended. Sure enough, the very next day, I received another letter from the HOA. This time, however, the tone was drastically different. It wasn't another list of demands or veiled threats, it was a formal apology. The letter acknowledged that I owned the property in question and had every legal right to block access to it. The HOA also stated they would no longer pursue any action regarding the fence or the gate. It was a relief to see them finally admitting what I had been arguing all along. But the letter didn't stop there. In a surprising turn, the HOA reminded all residents that private property needed to be respected, and trespassing was not acceptable under any circumstances. They made it abundantly clear that the shortcut through my land was no longer to be used by anyone in the community. It felt like a significant win, not just for me, but for anyone who had ever dealt with an overbearing HOA or entitled neighbors. The most unexpected part of the letter, though, was the note about Karen. They revealed that she had been advised to step down from her position on the HOA board. While they didn't provide the specifics, it wasn't hard to imagine why. Her actions had caused unnecessary conflict and embarrassment for the HOA, and it seemed they wanted to distance themselves from her behavior. I couldn't help but feel a sense of justice. After all the stress and drama, it felt like Karen had finally been held accountable. For the first time in months, life started to settle. Karen kept a low profile and was nowhere to be seen. The HOA didn't bother me again, and the gate stayed exactly where it was, standing strong and protecting what was rightfully mine. My property was finally off limits, and it felt amazing to reclaim my peace of mind. As the months went by, things returned to normal. Occasionally, neighbors would stop by to comment on the fence or ask about the whole situation, but most of them seemed to have moved on. The news coverage had helped them understand that I wasn't trying to cause problems, I was simply defending my rights. Even the HOA had turned its focus to other matters, and Karen's presence in the neighborhood became a distant memory. Reflecting on the entire experience, I could hardly believe how much of a battle it had been. What started with a few cars trespassing on my property had spiraled into confrontations, legal threats, and public drama. It had been stressful and exhausting, but I had learned a lot along the way, about property rights, the dynamics of living under an HOA, and the importance of standing firm when you know you're in the right. Sometimes I wonder if the neighbors who once used my property as a shortcut ever regretted it. The ordeal was strange and challenging, but it left me with one undeniable truth: I had protected what was mine, and no one would ever take that from me again.